Hello and welcome to this episode of Countercurrents. Today, my friend Alex Krainer is on. We're going to talk about the economic turmoil that is hitting the West and try to figure out whether Donald Trump actually knows how to play chess or is just struggling to learn to play checkers. Stay tuned, hit the like and subscribe button, and thanks for watching. Okay, man, we're live, sort of. I mean, look, by the time this comes out, a day or two will pass because I get an editor to clean up all my mistakes. So, how are you?
I'm doing well, Larry. It's very, very busy, but otherwise, still alive, still going on.
So let's start with the economic chaos in Europe, or is it appropriate to call it chaos? Well, how would you describe it?
I would describe it either as a dumpster fire or as a slow motion train wreck.
All right, good man.
Yeah. Things are bad. I don't, you can't tell quite yet on the street. Most, as they say, most men suffer in silence. But for sure, it's getting more and more difficult to make ends meet. I know that about 2 years ago, Eurostat published statistics about how well off the Europeans are, and it turns out that for the whole of Europe, 35% of all families have difficulties making ends meet, and in some countries, it's much, much higher than that. So that's more than a third of all households in Europe. So, that's supposed to be one of the most prosperous areas of the world, the wealthiest part of the world. So that's very dramatic. And we see that the job losses are accelerating. And so I think that we're probably on the verge of social uprisings, and we already have them in the UK, which I think is the weak link in as far as Western economies are concerned. So something's going to break, and we'll know it when it does.
What kind of do you think a major financial crisis is on the horizon? Because I do watch different commentators on the economic front, and it seems that there's a growing number that think, boy, something bad, really bad, is getting ready to happen.
I don't think it's going to be like that because the bankers have taken over. There's been a silent coup that I think was completed with around March 2020 with the pandemic, and the bankers took over, which means that they pretty much run the financial system, which means that they will not allow their institutions to fail. So I don't think that we're going to get any kind of a Lehman Brothers type of collapse. But what is going to happen is what happens in most countries that labor under an overhang of unpayable debts, and that's galloping inflation. So we're going to get a re-acceleration of inflation with an economic stagnation, which is what the term stagflation means. So that's, I think, what's on the menu. And I think that it's going to be accelerating, possibly hitting hyperinflation levels at some point in the future. This is not unusual. In fact, it may seem unusual for G7 economies because we always thought, nothing bad can ever happen to us. But I think that it's coming, and this is what we've seen in so many countries before, like Venezuela, Argentina, Zimbabwe, many others, in fact. And it's what happens when you have unpayable debts. The debts can't be removed from the system. And so the monetary authorities, rather than letting their institutions fail, they get the central bank to flood the system with liquidity to backstop all the bad debts and to keep the system rolling. But as they flood the system with liquidity, a lot of it spills into the consumer markets, and they end up pushing up inflation. the reason why the banks would be at risk of failing is because it's their clients who can no longer service their debts.
Right.
And if the economy doesn't grow at a certain rate, which needs to be faster than the growth of the monetary mass, then mathematically a growing proportion of those clients, which is private citizens and companies, are going to be going bankrupt, which means that they will not be able to service their debts, which means that the banks will find themselves with a growing mass of unpayable debts on their books, which would normally then at some point result in a bank run. But when bankers take over and you have fiat monetary system, meaning that there's no gold backing the currency and you don't need to have more gold to expand the monetary mass, then they just expand the monetary mass by printing money, which, printing, they don't have to print it. It's electronic now. And this is what's on the table for Europe, for Japan, for the UK. Ultimately, it might be on the table for the United States, but the United States is a different case, and the United States has all kind of maneuvering room to maybe not to avoid this, but to engineer a soft landing and a transition to a different monetary system without the system actually imploding.
Have you ever lived in a hyperinflation environment?
I have. So I grew up in one. I was born in 1970 in Yugoslavia, and Yugoslavia used to be a socialist country under a one-party communist government. And this is exactly what happened. And, central bank printed money, flooded the system with liquidity. And pretty much my whole youth, I saw prices just climbing and climbing and climbing, faster and faster and faster.
Yeah. I asked, because I lived in Argentina in 1984. Where they say, durante la hyperinflación, so, I had never experienced anything like this. And literally, it was sort of like being in the Weimar Republic must have been like, because the prices were changing from morning to afternoon. And, so back then they would print off on spreadsheets the prices in the store. And then at the end of the day, they'd print off another sheet with new prices.
Right.
What was fascinating about it is life did not grind to a halt. The money exchange places, they were doing big business because everybody was trying to get a hold of dollars at that time to hang on to value, and they would only, they wouldn't want to hang on to pesos. And yet, the effect it had on the middle class and the upper middle class was devastating.
Yes,
and it didn't become immediately apparent. A very very close friend, we actually lived with him for 6 months. He had been a baker, or he was a baker at the time. He had actually, produced the pastries that Aerolíneas Argentina was using, the Argentine airline. And, he had sold this, it was like a $1 million house in order to raise cash to build a bakery. And he sold it in like the end of 1982. Well, the inflation started hitting in 83. And in 1984, he gets informed, oh, you forgot to pay the land tax on that sale. It was now more money to pay the tax than what he had sold the house for 13 months previously. It was unbelievable.
Oh, so they recalculated it?
Yeah, they were indexing it. They were indexing it all along.
Oh, no. Oh, God. Yeah. Devastating. Yes.
So I went and visited him in 2002. He had gone from living in, some elegant homes. He was basically in a 4-room home. I went in to use the bathroom. The bathroom literally had a hole in the wall to the outside. And in Argentina in July, in June, it's chilly because you're south of the equator. And he was he was now, before he used to buy like a brand new Ford truck every year. Now he was driving something like a 10-year-old Renault, one of these,
Yeah.
little. So, when we talk about this, so inflation, I don't think people really appreciate or understand how it impacts the lives of people.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And, we have some anecdotal examples of what happened, for example, 100 years ago in Weimar, Germany, when they had their hyperinflation, which was 1922, 1923. At the end of the when the inflation unraveled, I think it was pretty much December 22. You were able to buy a 6-bedroom villa, like a nice 6-bedroom villa in the fashionable outskirts of Berlin for $100.
Wow. Yeah.
And the price of the Mercedes-Benz Corporation hit the low market cap, which was equivalent to, I think, 327 of their cars, which means that I assume that means that the company was basically going for free, because I bet you anything that they must have had that many cars in their dealerships and on their assembly lots,
Mm-hmm.
So that's just insane. But it does tell you something, that if you manage to preserve purchasing power through this crisis that's coming, however much, even if you take a 50% hit in the real terms, on the other end of the crisis, there's going to be deals to pick up. Meaning, you might be able to get a nice house for very little money, or you might be able to get stock shares of very good companies for very little money. So I think that, if we're talking about sailing through the crisis, the strategic objectives should be preserving purchasing power, and don't even dream about getting rich off of it, like you're going to pile money into Bitcoin and Nvidia and things like this, and then come up better off. I think if you lose only 50% in real terms, you did really, really well.
So one thing I'm seeing, and I appreciate your analysis and insights on this. I did a query out of curiosity and asked, what's happened to SWIFT? Are SWIFT transactions going up or down? The answer that came back said that the SWIFT is 15% decline this year compared to previous years. Really the first time in the history of keeping SWIFT statistics that they're seeing a decrease in activity. So that raises the question, is that because countries are now using digital means to settle transactions, move money, or is it because the BRICS countries are increasingly using their own currency, not using US dollars, or is it a combination of the two? How do you sort it out?
It's probably the combination of the two, but they knew that this was going to happen, because I read somewhere, I forget exactly where, but the people who were preparing sanctions on Russia, and they were preparing them well before February 2022, they knew that they were going to crash the SWIFT, because in their policy documents, they said we need to start preparing the SWIFT 2.0, because sanctions of Russia are the long-term effect of the sanctions of Russia are going to be that it's going to destroy the SWIFT.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's what we're seeing. Obviously, everybody out there sees that they're very, very vulnerable, because if you glance at the empire sideways, they can hurt you. They can sanction you. They can cut you off from the SWIFT, and that you have to diversify your exposure to these financial systems. And there's no, there's not much to think about. There you have the Western financial system, or you have the new emerging one that's coming out from the BRICS and the multipolar integrations, which is now nothing more than countries trading in their own currency, but that is an alternative. So I think that more and more countries are doing exactly that.
So do you think that as BRICS countries in particular, and I'm thinking of China and Brazil, the China and Brazil have really made some pretty dramatic moves on the trade front, where uh, China used to buy soybeans from U.S. farmers. Now they said, forget it. They're buying it from Brazil, and it's creating a real crisis among the soybean farmers here in the States. And then the coffee that China, I guess normally in the past, if you wanted to start exporting coffee to China, you're going to have to jump through a bunch of administrative hoops, and it could take 3 months, 6 months, maybe a year to navigate that bureaucracy. My understanding is that when China and Brazil started to do this, they made the agreements within like 2 days. It was like super speed. But as they're doing all this settlement in their currencies, the demand for dollars is going down. And then on top of it, you've got India and China both selling off U.S. treasuries. So is it correct to see what we've got is this increasing supply of dollars out there, but there's no demand for it per se, which is that what's contributing to the drop in the value of the dollar?
It may be, I don't know exactly, but it is, it's obvious that for some reason the dollar is going down. When Trump entered office, the euro was trading at around $1.05 to the euro.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's $1.18 to the euro. So that's about 15-16% decline in the value of in the purchasing power of the dollar versus the euro. And then, similar change versus the pound, maybe a bit less, and against the yen. But I think that I wonder if this isn't done deliberately, because United States has a big debt problem, not necessarily much bigger than.
That's being diplomatic. It's gargantuan.
Yeah, but the thing is that everybody else does among the advanced economies, with the exception of Russia, And so you have about $37 trillion in public debt, meaning federal government debt, and you have then another, let's call it 70 some trillion dollars in all other forms of debt, private, state and local governments, and financial and non-financial corporations. You arrive to something in the neighborhood of $110 trillion, which I think works out to about $300,000 per man, woman, and child in the United States. And if you want to recalculate that per taxpayer, I think it's well north of $500,000. So it's absurd. It's unpayable. And so, one way to get rid of that is to inflate it away, to let your currency drop, and then you pay it off with worthless dollars that you print out. And then it has another effect. It's making foreign imports more expensive in your country, and it's making your exports to other countries more competitive. So I wonder if this isn't being done deliberately by the Trump administration exactly for those reasons. In the shorter term, it's making the United States more competitive, and then in the longer term, it could inflate away the debt overhang.
Well, we've had another form of, I'll call it unofficial inflation, or it's built-in inflation that we don't pay attention to. What's happened to housing prices? I know, like, for example, I bought the place where I live in 2019. It's now doubled in value, more than doubled in value, in just 6 years. Now, people go, oh, it's paper wealth. But the fact that, it's not just me. I mean, at the houses throughout, particularly on the west coast of Florida, they've doubled, in some cases tripled. Now, that's a form. I view that as another form of inflation. It's not like you go to the store and have to pay double the price for an apple, but nonetheless, when you get these inflated real estate values, because it's not like the land all of a sudden, I started growing gold bars in my backyard. It's like,
Yeah.
If that had happened, yeah, I could understand. Yeah, the house price went up, but nothing changed other than people wanting to move to Florida.
Yeah, right. But then what about the property taxes? Did they double as well?
No, that's what's interesting.
Oh, okay.
They've
Okay, at least that,
yeah,
because
they've stayed.
otherwise it would be crushing.
Well, in Florida, they've stayed down. In other states, though, my understanding is they've gone up and gone up. If they are pegging it to what is sort of a current value, estimated value of the real estate, then you get killed.
Yeah, and then you get families that have lived in the same place for generations now have to move out
Yeah,
because they can no longer, they built the house with their own labor, or they paid for it, and now they have to move out because they can't afford to pay the tax on it, which shouldn't even happen in a free society.
correct.
That's another one of those fraud that's been slipped in somewhere along the way that actually, you have to ask yourself, do you even own your house in that case?
Mm-hmm.
Because in the final analysis, you don't. The government loaned it out to you or let you use it, provided that you pay the rent to them.
Right. Yeah. This um, I compared the G7 debt to GDP ratio to the BRICS countries' debt to GDP ratio. And, it was really sort of shocking when you step back and look at it that every single country in the G7, with the exception, Germany, they're now at like a 78% debt to GDP, but everybody else was 100 or more. And yet on the BRICS side of the house, there may have been one or two that were at 100 or more, but Russia at 19%. It is like, we're witnessing the transformation of the international world financial and economic system, in my judgment. And I put it on par with what took place at the end of World War II with the creation of Bretton Woods. We're in the midst of something new being born, and I don't think a lot of people in the West have caught up to that. What do you think?
Well, I think it's potentially bigger than that even. I think we might be breaking with the last few hundred years, maybe 500 or 600 years of history in this transformation, because one of the things that is becoming obvious is that the current monetary system that we have is pretty much the source that is poisoning all other relations in society, and that it's it's the root cause of permanent wars, of misery in not only the global South, but increasingly in what we call the Golden West.
Mm-hmm.
And this is always the same thing, and it always boils down to usury, because all the money that's in circulation is created as debt. It reflects debt, and it's only growing and increasing, and it has to be paid back with interest, and that interest compounds. So the monetary system is pretty much operating like a giant conveyor belt that's sucking wealth, or a vacuum cleaner that's sucking real wealth from everywhere where it's produced, and then concentrating it with this very, very small banking cartel, which is, on the axis Wall Street and City of London, and it's inflicting misery on everybody else. And the farther it goes, the worse it gets. And so I think that the awareness of this problem is starting to spread. And I think that's largely thanks to the internet, because, we get to have this conversation. We get to publish papers. They get to be read. People talk to each other. And I read at some point, in the aftermath of World War II, after the Bretton Woods Agreement, somebody there, maybe John Maynard Keynes or somebody, they were talking about this, and someone said, maybe Dexter White, I don't know, said, "Oh, maybe maybe there's a dozen or so people in the whole world that understand how the monetary system actually operates. Today, maybe it's a small percentage, but it's, absolutely orders of magnitude bigger. And then, the only game in town was London and New York. The
Right.
two financial centers of the world were London and New York, Paris to a lesser extent. This is who you had to deal with. If you wanted to trade, if you wanted to participate in the global economic activity, it all had to go through either New York or through London or a little bit maybe through Paris. But that was it. Today we have real alternatives emerging, which is, the BRICS organization, China, Russia to an extent.
Well, yeah. I mean, let me ask you on that point that China right now, the five largest banks in the world, I think at least three, maybe four of the largest banks are Chinese banks. Are they operating according to the same, let's say, infrastructure and purpose as the banks in London and New York, or are they actually opening up sort of a new road, a new alternative?
I think they are operating on the same principle, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are inherently and inevitably evil, because even the Western banking didn't have to become evil and pathogenic. That was a choice. It was a conscious, deliberate choice, which was made. My impression is that this choice was made kind of explicitly in the aftermath of World War II,
Mm-hmm.
because primarily the British, they were the ringleaders, but the American bankers tagged along and pretty much adopted the same strategy. The strategy was to take the stranglehold of strategically important commodities around the world, but especially oil, and to make sure that they control all or as much as possible of the oil production and trade. And then the choice was made deliberately to keep all resource exporting nations poor. And that was formulated by Henry Kissinger in his famous National Security Memorandum 200. I forget what year that is, but at some point, I think in the 50s. So there were initiatives by various nations. When Germany and France started to recover economically in the 50s, and Italy, they started to speak with the Iranians, with the Saudis, with the Soviets, and they wanted to develop. They wanted to exchange, let's say, take guaranteed deliveries of crude oil at a certain price that will be agreed in exchange for technology. And what countries like Iran and Brazil wanted, for example, and Mexico, they wanted to develop their nuclear technology. And all of this was nipped in the bud. This is, for example, why the Shah of Iran was overthrown, because he wanted to use the proceeds from oil sales to develop a very extensive nuclear program. The Brazilians wanted the same, the Mexicans wanted the same, and the Germans and the French were entering into contracts. And so, the banking sector could have supported that. And they wanted to support it. Like German and French bankers and industrialists were already developing all these deals around the world. So we're talking about 1950s and 1960s. And then the New York and London bankers deliberately decided to destroy all this. So, for example, there was a man called Enrico Mattei in Italy who pretty much single-handedly developed Italian energy sector,
Hmm.
their own indigenous oil industry. He went to Libya, he went to Syria, he went to different places, making his own contracts outside of the Seven Sisters
Right.
big oil. And then, he met an untimely death in 1956, I think, uh, because he wouldn't stop, even though he was threatened, told to stop. Then there was a German banker who wanted to support. The idea was always, we need your resources, but we can help you develop your energy sector. We can give you technology transfer. We can build out your infrastructure. And what Henry Kissinger wrote in that NSM 200 document, NSSM, I think, no,
And
he basically spelled out, not in those exact terms, but we're going to keep them poor and miserable, because if we don't, they're going to absorb this stuff that they produce in their own economies, and then they're going to be very expensive for us to buy. But if they're poor, then they totally depend on us, and they're going to have to sell their resources dirt cheap to us.
yeah.
And we're going to control all the flows, and everybody's going to have to buy from us. And then, the cream on top of the cake is always that our banks are going to finance all this development, which means that all of their resources are going to be collateral on the books of our banks. And so that was done deliberately.
Hmm.
And that's when, the heavy-handed, they just determined that nuclear was the enemy. And they decided at that point that they were going to try to slow down or stop the development of nuclear power development. And it was done that way. And that's why we had those oil shocks, 1973,
Right.
1979. Then, Volcker came into the Federal Reserve, increased the interest rate to 16%, then to 20%. Basically, the effect of this was that practically it arrested, it stopped dead industrial development of the global south. First, oil went from, in 1973, went up like 400%. And a lot of these countries were basing their industrial development on oil, which was, I think, $3 or $4 a barrel. And then it jumped to almost 12. And then at the end of the 1970s, it jumped a lot higher still on the back of Iran regime change, 1979.
Right.
And I think it brought it to, at some point, to $40 a barrel. So countries couldn't cope anymore. And to keep buying oil, they had to go deep into debt. So they became more and more in debt to the IMF and the World Bank and other private financial institutions in the West. And then that made them vulnerable to interest rate hike. So Volcker comes in, hikes the interest rate, and practically crashes the whole world. And then you had the big debt crisis of 1980s and everybody on the hook to the IMF and to the Western world, basically for everything, including food production.
Well, let me, let's call this the colonial legacy. Suck the resources out of the global south, out of these countries that have been, were occupied or controlled in one form or fashion by, England, France, Germany, the Netherlands, the different colonial enterprises. And those countries they really didn't develop. You weren't seeing the buildup of infrastructure. It looks now that China in the lead, but with Russia, lesser extent India, but that China really is the principal driving force now it appears to be creating a new model. Now,
yes.
Some may accuse me of being naive, but I don't see the same sort of locust behavior. The locusts drive in and they eat everything. They consume it, destroy crops. And instead of destroying, it looks like they're going in and actually building up infrastructure in these countries and actually helping raise the wealth of those countries. And I think part of it is they understand if we get those countries more wealthy, they're going to buy more of our crap.
Well, yeah, that's exactly it, because I think that, first of all, if you raise living standards, then you reduce social tensions and you reduce the risk of war. If you're an advanced industrial nation, it makes sense because you're creating markets with purchasing power that are going to be buying your products. So you're creating a win-win situation where everybody, like you're lifting everybody higher. But and this is almost obvious, and it was banking and industrial interests in France, Germany, and Italy during the 50s and the 70s were actually pursuing this strategy, this approach. It made total sense. We have industries, we have technology, we have the know-how, you have the resources, and we can exchange this in a mutually beneficial trade. And then as your economies develop, you're going to be buying more and more from us. But these London and New York circles, and I think it's on ideological grounds. No, I don't think it was on the ideological grounds, because they actually, this group of bankers and economists actually called themselves, they refer to themselves as neo-Malthusians. And what does that mean? That means that they were taking the ideological cue from Thomas Malthus, the East India Company economist, who was basically advocating depopulation.
Mm-hmm.
He was like, there's too much of this vermin, so we need to keep them poor and miserable, and we need to extinguish them from time to time to get rid of them all. I don't have other explanation for it other than I think there's something satanic at the core of that approach.
Mm-hmm.
And this, there's nothing inevitable about this. Banking can be a very useful service to society. It can foster growth, improving standard of living, prosperity, but it has to be, you have to make deliberate choices. Hey, let's use credit to build out infrastructure. Let's use credit to build out the energy sector, industries, and so forth. There's an old Chinese proverb that says, if you want to grow rich, first build a road. It's quite obvious.
Yeah.
So the fact that we are where we are is a bit astonishing in fact, but you can really trace it back to a deliberate decision that was made in the aftermath of World War II by the London banking cartel and their allies on Wall Street.
Yeah. China in particular fascinates me as far as the animus now that exists in the United States directed at China. And, I'm old enough to recall when Richard Nixon went to Beijing in 1972, and this establishment of a new China policy where the United States basically said, yeah, there's one China. And I remember there was some protest at the time about abandoning Taiwan, but, it became sort of okay that we're accepting the fact that Taiwan is part of China. And I've been trying to figure out why this attitude in the United States changed. My hypothesis, I haven't really been able to document it yet, but I think it's doable, is that when the chip industry started taking off in Taiwan, and it became, people began to see that NVIDIA and these other chip makers, that how critical it was, I think that's the point at which the attitude in the United States shifted from, hey, China's our friend and we're going to support them economically, to China's an enemy and we got to stop them. Do you have any insights on that?
Well, not especially, but it's clear that China is basically upending their whole business model. It's overturning it, and if you run the whole world and you make everybody equally miserable, then you can say things like, "Oh, well, prosperity is finished," or this nonsense that I studied economics. I took it very seriously when I was in university. But like they start brainwashing you with the idea of scarcity.
Yes.
From Econ 101. Oh, it's like it's unlimited wants and limited resources. So it's going to be miserable. It's going to be this dog eat dog, the cutthroat competition for resources. And so we kind of got almost used to the idea, and that it's hard, and that you have to really work hard to do something. Life is miserable. Life is difficult, and in the end, we're just going poorer and poorer because the same resources have to feed larger and larger population. And so you can brainwash people with that if everybody's equally miserable and there's no other reference point. But now China, in the last 40 years, they managed to lift 850 million of their people out of poverty.
Yeah.
If you look at the infrastructure they built up, it's immensely impressive. They laid down something like 32,000 miles of high-speed railroads in the last 20 years. Do you know how many the United States did?
Is it like 20? 20 miles maybe in California?
I think in California, it's maybe something like 300 feet, but I think the total of the United States is maybe 100 miles or something like that, at a cost that's absolutely insane. I mean, millions per mile. And I don't even remember. I actually did the math on this. It's absolutely insane. But the Chinese have done it in a fraction of time, for a fraction of dollars, and built out a 20,000 mile, 30-some thousand mile high-speed railway network.
Yeah.
And the United States, which was supposed to be the wealthiest, most advanced country in the world, built pretty much zilch.
Well, have you ever ridden on the Acela train between Washington and New York? That's the so-called high speed train, because it goes like 70 miles an hour as opposed to 50 miles an hour. But it's
a shame. It's a great missed opportunity. And if you go back and if you remember the campaign promises by President, I remember from at least Bill Clinton, they always talk about high-speed rail networks and clean diesel technologies and blah, 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 blah. And what? It's now 30 years later and nothing has been done.
Yeah.
Not a thing. And the things that they have done pretty much turned out grifts. Everybody who was involved put away a lot of millions in their private bank accounts, and nothing was built. So something is deeply wrong. And I think that it's not by accident. I'm convinced that it was done deliberately.
Yeah, well, one more train story. I used to live over on the Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Boca Raton, West Palm. That's sort of this corridor. And they do have a train that travels up and down sort of for public transportation. There's continually that train is running over people, hitting cars, because they've got the old-fashioned system of the gates lower and the cars line up and wait as the train goes hurtling past. But again, I'd call it 1950s technology, and there's been no effort to really upgrade it and modernize. But meanwhile, you look at the transformation. It's not just in China; it's in Russia too. I was just blown away by their subway system. I mean, it's heaven. I've been on the subway, the metro system in Washington, D.C. and in New York City. And good Lord, there's just no comparison. And yet the United States takes great pride in its mediocrity. It's the only way I can describe it.
I think there's a very deep ideological problem in the United States. Is if anything is being done by the state, it's immediately attacked as like, oh, socialism. Now Trump bought a controlling share in Intel,
right?
And they're immediately attacking him. Oh, state capitalism, socialism. They're moving us in the wrong direction. And there's an assumption that's not even questioned by anybody that I can tell, that anything run by the government is automatically going to be a mess and it's not going to work. But then, I ask people, well, who do you think controls a Swiss railway system? Who do you think operates the Japanese railway system? These are very, very highly complex pieces of national infrastructure that work like a violin. They work like a Swiss clock. They're fast, they're convenient, they're always on time, they're cheap, and they serve a great good to the whole economy. So, then, people say, well, yeah, but it's not profitable. What does it matter? Here's the thing that we need to kind of question. Not every system in an economy has to be profitable in and of itself. And I'll give you the example of the Erie Canal. So when Erie Canal was constructed, it reduced the cost of trading between the Great Lakes and the East Coast of the United States by 90%. So that enabled rapid economic development of on both sides, but especially on the Great Lakes side, that simply wouldn't have been possible without the canal. So now if the company that operated canal turned out to be unprofitable, what does it matter if it lowers the cost of transactions for everybody by 90%?
Right.
So that's, in that sense, that infrastructure has enormous value to everyone. But if you give it into private hands, you can practically guarantee that it's going to deteriorate and it's going to fall to rust. Because why? Because it has to be maintained. Maintenance costs money. That's an expense. Expenses reduce profits. So if you say Erie Canal goes on New York Stock Exchange and it has a stock price 100, well, you reduce the maintenance. Now it's going to be even more profitable, and the stock price is going to go up. The C-suite doesn't care that maintenance means that with time, the whole piece of infrastructure is going to deteriorate and lose its value, because they're going to be collecting a bunch of their bonuses and retire. And if the whole country loses that piece of infrastructure, they don't care. But the whole nation lost. And this is, I think, the system that has contributed to the overall general deterioration of infrastructure in the United States. And so it brings you back. What's better, if the state takes care of it, or if you give it into private hands, where the only order of the day is maximize profits and the shareholder value?
Well, I would say, how important has been the financial considerations in driving European animus, anger towards Russia, and in wanting to pursue a war strategy with Russia? That, because it seems to me that there's nothing else to objectively explain why France, the UK, Germany are so obsessed with Russia, other than there's got to be a financial angle to it.
I don't really see that, because Europeans aren't on the same page ideologically as the United States and the UK. There isn't this free market neoliberal fundamentalism in Europe as there is in the US. And so I don't think that is the case. And I would even question whether Europeans actually do have this Russia derangement syndrome. That's being promoted in the mainstream media.
Well, not the people. I'm talking more of the leadership.
Oh, you're talking about the governments?
Yeah, the governments.
Oh, that's a different story. Yeah, well, the governments represent the banking cartel again, and some of them are part of the banking cartel. What's his face? Friedrich Merz in Germany.
Yeah, BlackRock.
Former BlackRock. Emmanuel Macron is a Rothschild banker. Yeah. Keir Starmer is not a banker, but he's a minion of Tony Blair, who is Mr. City of London. He's the knight companion of the most noble order of the Garter, which is, the top echelon of the City of London.
Right.
And, he's really running the show, I think, not Keir Starmer. Anyway, they're all banker errand boys. And I think that what the bankers are, the reason why the bankers hate Russia is because Russia has $75 trillion worth of estimated natural resources, right. Wealth. And so the European bankers want to control that. And the reason why they want to control that is because they could then turn that into their own collateral. And if they control that as their own collateral, they can issue loans to their clients, meaning European oil and gas corporations, gold mining, copper mining, all of those corporations, they can issue them loans, and then those loans become assets on their books, and those corporations have to repay them in interest. So basically, on the back of that arrangement, all the wealth that is underground in Russia starts to be financialized and flowing to the London and New York banks. And Vladimir Putin won't let us have it. He's selfishly keeping it for the Russian people. And so he's got to go, That's mm-hmm. not tolerable.
Well, yeah, and so that was what I was trying to get at. You've got this disconnect between the public sentiment and then what the leadership is advocating. I don't know how long that tension can continue. At some point it's got to break, particularly as the economic conditions for the average, French citizen, German citizen, British citizen worsen. So let's I wanted to talk about Donald Trump and the 5D strategy, but we laid all this as groundwork. So do you think still that Trump knows what he's doing, or is being told what to do, or is it something in between?
Let's put it this way. I believe that Trump has a mission. I'm not sure that he has a strategy, though.
Okay.
And so I think that he's fumbling a lot. But I think that his mission is, and I even, I spoke with Susan Kokinda a few weeks ago, and she told me something that Trump said during the election campaign in the gathering of the Republican caucus of Michigan. So this was not, hold on.
Yeah.
So this was not a campaign event with tens of thousands of people there. This was like a smaller gathering. But at that gathering, he called for the people present to join him in a decisive battle against the global financier class. I think that's pretty much exact words that Susan Kokinda said to me. And she made the effort to say exactly the words that Trump said. Now, if it's true that he said that, that's very significant, because that would be a very random thing to say unless you meant it.
Right.
And if you meant it, you had to have thought things through. You had to have understood what you're up against. And so I think that Trump is serious about this. And so far in these 8 months of his presidency, I see a lot of evidence that he actually means that. Now, where Trump is very difficult to approve of is the stuff going on in the Middle East.
Right.
But here's what I think, Larry. All of these events, like as George Soros told us, we're experiencing a conflict between two systems of governance. And that's not exactly right. It's one system against everybody else. And that one system is the neo-colonialist, imperialistic system of governance that always emanates from the money-lending oligarchies, which is, again, back to City of London and Wall Street.
Mm-hmm.
And everything else is downstream from there. Ukraine war and the war in Palestine, they're two different battlegrounds of the same conflict. And it seems to me that Trump is taking on the global financier class, but I think that he's not tackling it on the branch level. He's trying to tackle it at the root level. And so what do you have to do? I think that, I think I pretty much made up my mind about this today, believe it or not. But I think that ultimately you're going to have to crash the dollar. You're going to have to bring the dollar to zero. And here's why I think that. I've been very mystified that the British, who are basically a small island nation, who have a really tiny army, and they have a very insignificant navy, and yet they're going everywhere around the world, and they're signing military cooperation agreements with all these governments everywhere. And they're everywhere. They're in Syria, they're in Bosnia, they're in Ukraine, they're signing 100-year. I couldn't understand, where does their power come from? And I worked out that they have a very, very extensive intelligence network, which is apparently very effective and very clever and very ruthless. They have special forces, which they deploy here and there as needed. They have certain influence over U.S. policymaking. They definitely have dominance over Western mainstream media. And they have a very, very extensive network of NGOs, private corporations, charities, and things like this, through which they infiltrate target countries, penetrate into their government system, figure out where the pressure nodes are, and then work their influence like that. But still, that's a lot for one small island nation, and you need a lot of money for that, because even if you find those nodes, you're going to have to slip some money under the table to all those people. And we're talking thousands upon thousands of NGOs. Somebody's funding them. How? And then basically it's the petrodollar system, which is in decline, but it still exists. And I just heard this morning, Alistair MacLeod, he said that there's about $10 trillion in the petrodollar system, and is dominated by London through their, spider's web offshore centers. So they control that money, not the United States, even though it's US dollar.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's their sort of source of strength. And because it's the same currency as the US dollar in the United States, but you don't have control over it, I think you have to crash the dollar in order to finally quarantine the City of London and leave them to their own devices on their little island.
Yeah, no, I think that's where we're headed.
And by the way, the monetary base of the United States, I think, is about $6 trillion. So if it's true that the petrodollar offshore dollar system is $10 trillion, that would mean that London has control over a bigger mass of US dollars than the United States does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's something I literally kind of came to that conclusion today after listening to Alistair MacLeod's recent interview. But it makes sense to me because something has to explain the power of the United Kingdom, which is a basket case economically, financially, no army, no navy. How do they project so much power? There's got to be an explanation.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually pretty insightful, because you're right. Otherwise, I look at the UK as just like a snappy, nasty little dog with no teeth.
Correct.
Loud, obnoxious, but there's no visible power to it. But you're right; they sure seem to create a hell of a lot of mayhem in the world, and
Yeah, well,
Syria, Armenia, Azerbaijan.
Larry, it's everywhere you look. I mean, I honestly came to the conclusion that probably if you manage to quarantine all the agents of the City of London around the world, if you manage to quarantine their influence, that probably 90, if not 100% of all the problems in the world would vanish. It's there everywhere. I was in February of this year, I read that Britain had signed a very hush-hush military cooperation agreement with the government of Bosnia and Herzegovina in Sarajevo. And I was floored. I thought, like, why? What's the connection? Why would, this is a nation in the middle of the Balkans, and this is the other nation, which is an island in the Atlantic with basically no army, no way to come to the aid if something happened. What's the logic? And then, I know that they signed a military cooperation agreement with Poland, with Denmark, with Sweden, with France. And then I went to a search engine to find nations with which Britain had signed military cooperation agreements over the recent years. And it's a few dozen of them. They're everywhere. They just signed a military cooperation agreement with Kazakhstan, and for the first time in history, they sent a military attaché there. Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Sudan, Somalia, you name it, they're just everywhere. And pretty much everywhere they go, mayhem follows.
Yeah. Boy. Well, we'll close on mayhem then. I've kept you now for over an hour, and I know that your time is valuable. But I think we've had a pretty good discussion with exploring how this whole range of international economics and finance come to bear on the lives of people as they go about their daily business.
There's Larry, it's a pleasure to chat, of course, and we could go on for many hours because this is our lives today, and I think that this is deciding which way humanity goes from here. So it's very highly complex, but it's also not obvious because we're subjected to a blizzard of psyops.
Yeah.
And it's coming from all sides. It's full of nonsense. I think it's really, really important to remember George Soros's words, two systems of governance, which he says open societies versus closed societies, but it's not. It's this colonialist system of the moneylenders against everybody else, including their own populations at home.
Well, that's what makes this venue is so important, because of the power of government to try to manipulate information and control it. And I saw it firsthand when I was at CIA, but back then it was pre-social media days. We did it the old-fashioned way: plant stories in newspapers and magazines, or hire people that would go out with an actual camera with film and film something, but then plant the stories. And I've commented before, there was this French author, I don't know if you ever heard of him, Jean-Jacques Servan-Schreiber.
No.
So he was a magazine publisher in France, I believe. Boy, he hated the CIA, and he was convinced that the CIA was behind a whole number of things. We were planning stories in his magazine, and he didn't realize it. So knowing that, with where we are with the power of the internet today, it's important that, we get into the exchanges like you and I are having, and, people like the Duran, the boys on the Duran, and then, even Danny Haifong and Danny Davis and Nima, we start building this community of an alternative media without it being media, but at least the information's accessible. People can hear it, think about it for themselves, and maybe, just maybe.
I think it's making a difference, Larry, inevitably, because this never existed in the past.
Yeah.
And it's a completely new element to the social equation. And there's no, it's just impossible that it's not having an impact. And that means that all of their playbooks now have unpredictable outcomes. They can't, they can't count on them being able to manipulate us into next war and the next war and the next war and the next war. So, but yeah, we have to keep on talking. We have to keep on researching, figuring things out, sharing the information and knowledge and so forth, and resisting the mind effery, that's coming from everywhere.
Yeah. Well, I look back over the last 4 years. 4 years ago, I didn't know you. I mean, I knew of you. I'd read your book, but now I know you. We haven't met in person yet. That will happen. But, I didn't know Pepe Escobar. I didn't know Alistair Crook. Now I know them and have met them. Glenn Deason, the two Alexes of the Duran, Maciras and Cristoforo. So I feel sort of blessed. I'm building up this new community of friends that open up my eyes and broaden my horizon. So thank you for being part of that.
Great pleasure, Larry. Thank you as well. Likewise.
All right, my friend. Thanks a lot.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Alex is a great individual, good friend, a wise financial advisor, and a good geopolitical analyst. So I hope you enjoyed our conversation. If you did, please hit the like and subscribe button. We'll continue to grow the channel. And for now, I'm Larry Johnson, and this is Countercurrents. Thanks for watching.